Hello and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And I know we actually just got a big swell of new subscribers, so welcome. I hope you enjoy this as much as you enjoyed my appearance on the show earlier this week. And starting out, probably the biggest news story this week is Lebanon. And oh boy, this came out of nowhere. So, as a brief, there was an explosion in Lebanon that was massive. Now, the official story is that it came from this ship being held in the harbor that had explosive materials on it that just mysteriously went off and decimated the most important port in the country, that is a country primarily reliant on sea trade, already in economic crisis and already in a social and political crisis. So you have that happening. Something like in the thousands dead with tens of thousands injured, I think like tens of millions, not hundreds of millions of property damage done at this point. Yeah, some of the photos there, I don't think I could get away with showing them on this show without, of course, our overlords at YouTube taking any action against that. But if you have the stomach for it, it's definitely something to look at because, I mean, out of all the footage of disasters I have watched, I wouldn't say it's quite 9/11 levels, but it's close. From, like I said, what I've watched of it, it's pretty nasty even by Middle Eastern standards. And this came out of nowhere. This Nobody was expecting this, and like I said, this already on top of massive protests in the country, an economic crisis in the country, budding civil war, yet another budding civil war. They just got done with the other one, like what, 25, 30 years ago. It's not hardly even a generation ago. Generation or two, I suppose. But that happens. There's all sorts of speculations on who did it. Of course, the big ones being thrown around are Israel and Hezbollah, trying to false flag their way into a war. I've seen one of the more outlandish takes is that it was a Belarusian ship carrying Russian explosives that set this off. So make of that what you will. But regardless,
Lukashenko will have his day.
Lukashenko, I guess, will have his day over this. But I mean, if you really want to go down that rabbit hole with all the stuff happening in Belarus, which we'll cover later in the show, I'm sure there's somebody out there who will make that connection, and they probably work at the New York Times, if we're being honest. But uh,
That's right. That's
but
right.
this is still probably one of the biggest events to happen in the Middle East in the past several years, and that's not to discount all the stuff happening in Syria and Libya, but you expect chaos out of those countries that have either undergone a regime change or undergone an attempted regime change into a civil war. But Lebanon, which has been relatively politically stable considering the region it's in, this is a big surprise. Now, the other big piece of news out of this is Macron really seems to have pounced on this, is really trying to take the lead on this crisis and show that France is here to fix the situation. He's currently en route to Lebanon right now. I believe he's actually in an overlay in Greece, according to the last news reports, but going there with medical workers, aid workers, and he had a very interesting address for the people there. And he referred to them as the people of Tripoli, a name that has not been used
The
in what,
county of Tripoli.
800 years now, something like that. Again, I guess you saw the memes in 2016. Base Trump is gonna get the 10th Crusade. Well, step aside, Dotard Blump. Looks like Macron is the new Crusader.
He's obviously wants you to draw a parallel between Hezbollah and the Mamelukes who took the city, who took the county of Tripoli in the 13th century. He did say, "We'll always be here for you." Yeah, he arrived less than 24 hours, well, just a little over 24 hours after the explosion. So he pounced on this pretty quickly. And I got to say, whether you like Macron or not, and, this is a bit of a Macron stan account, but um, he handled the crowds beautifully. Like, uh, people were very emotional. They were definitely looking for him for help. He even made a statement that it's up to the people of Lebanon to have a revolution, uh, and so on, right? That there's only so much France can do besides medical aid and security aid and all that kind of stuff. Of course, he mentioned the UN, the IMF, all the all the helpers. Um, the timing is quite remarkable, isn't it? That as tensions were growing between Hezbollah and Israel, as the state of Syria continues to go on its way and seemingly endless violence and war, we should have this happen. But sometimes these things do happen, and this immediately made me recall the explosion that happened in China 5 years ago in the port city of Tianjin or Taijin. I'm probably mispronouncing it badly, but that killed over 116 people. The death count so far in Lebanon is, I think, 135 or 137 as of late night yesterday or early morning today. The count is probably much higher than that.
Yeah, this is who they
But
can just
there have
confirm.
been others. Yeah, there there have been others, other disasters, which have blown up port cities for the same reasons, for the same chemical compounds. These basic fertilizers and so on.
Yeah,
Um,
I think the big
I've
concern
seen
with this
videos
one
where
is the just the instability of Lebanon. I mean, because a country like China, even 5 years ago, that again was bad, but you didn't have the impression that it was going to destroy the entire country.
right, right, yeah, yeah, two very different countries in that sense. But it's just to say that these sort of things do happen, and you could argue that Lebanon has been kind of like, as you say, stable but barely functional for many many years. Especially after um, the civil war, which dragged on for 13 years, beginning in 1975, and its banking system still was robust enough, but then it got devalued in the late 80s. And but as you said, it depended on that port more than anything else, and now that port is demolished. Literally, it's a crater. Um, it'll be very interesting to see how Lebanon is rebuilt and what kind of influences are going to play a part. But I can't help but think that Macron's visit is going to cause tensions now between Europe and Hezbollah,
Yeah,
and how
and
that will automatically play into the hands of Israel.
and you had these sentiments going around, which included a petition going around in Lebanon by mainly the Catholics there, calling on France to be their protector once again, as it was in the 13th century, as it was in the 20th century, following World War II with the French mandate there. And of course, for those of you who know about the history of the Civil War between um, the Lebanese Catholic groups and Hezbollah and the other various factions there, it was mainly between them, and there's still a lot of animosity today. There's been times where we thought they were just going to kill each other just since the beginning of this year, and now you have that. You have Macron, and you have their reaction to Macron, and of course Hezbollah isn't going to have a positive reaction to this. And as you said, now Israel has put its Northern Army Command on high alert. That's the one right on the border of Lebanon, partially even occupying Lebanon. And again, this also follows the clashes between Israel and Hezbollah last year. So it seems like quite literally a powder keg just went off in that country. Not only, again, with the actual explosion, the damage from that, but I think this was the one thing, even assuming it was entirely an accident and not some sort of false flag, not any sort of sabotage, this is enough to push them over the edge. Even if they don't blame each other for it, just the absolute implosion of their economy that will follow this. I don't see any way they're going to get around
Yeah,
this economic implosion. There's no way that these groups, which have held back thus far, are not going to take out their frustration on each other now.
right. And I think it serves Israel for there to be perhaps another civil war between Hezbollah and uh, the Catholics, and maybe even some of the Sunnis in Lebanon. It takes pressure off of them, Um, we should also mention that Iranian officials already arrived prior to Macron. They were not greeted very warmly by some of the citizens. Of course, that doesn't really explain all of Lebanon, but yeah. So it's going to be interesting how this plays out. This is going to be a story that I think is going to be in the news for several months. It's still very early. It'll be interesting. I think the main player that this to watch, I think, will be Hezbollah. And are they going to play this intelligently? Are they going to not get sucked in by what has happened? Um, Despite the blame that I'm sure will be coming toward them in the coming weeks, the framing on the news, and I'm not just talking about Western news, but I'm talking about news in the Middle East, news emanating from Israel, and so on. Um, to me, that's going to be the main story. How are they going to react to this? And Hezbollah has been generally speaking, um, it has been generally speaking very clever, very smart
Yeah,
in the
well,
way that
for
it deals with Israel.
for the past decade, almost all of Hezbollah's resources and focus has been put into Syria. So it's going. I think the majority of their armed wing is currently in Syria right now. Of course, they've been dealing with Israeli strikes there. So again, it's going to depend on them. Will they? I guess you could say take the bait, if you will,
Hmm.
or will
Hmm.
perhaps the other factions in the country take the bait and set it off? Because, like I said, even assuming this is 100% accident, there are plenty of groups, plenty of people, plenty of countries that would like to see Lebanon descend back into a state of chaos, especially now
Right.
that it seems Syria has more or less stabilized, and the spillover you get between the regions, between countries in that region. And honestly, maybe it'll draw in. I laugh because of how terrifying this thought is, really. But maybe it'll draw in a new base for ISIS or whatever offshoot is left of them, and we'll get some Sunni Muslim group operating out of Lebanon now because I could see it going that way. They tend to fill these
Right.
vacuums like in Syria, like in Iraq, like in Libya. Maybe this is their next destination, and I'm sure they'll have a very adversarial relationship with Israel. I'm sure Israel will be striking targets of whatever this new Sunni Islamic group is all the time. It's just
Yeah.
it's going to be a horrible relationship based on what we saw in Iraq and Syria. Definitely no backdoor cooperations there. No, not at all. And like I said, this is actually also an opportunity for Macron, who wants to paint France as this new world power who is capable of dealing with the United States, China, Russia. He wants to play France and and to an extent the European Union on that scale. This may be yet another opportunity to prove himself in that regard, prove himself as the leader of a what you could call a global power. And another one we also need to look at is I didn't. I I don't think you thought it, and I didn't think it. But did you expect Russia to step in Libya? Seeing the trends
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
they stepped in Syria, they stepped in Libya. I don't see a way they get out of not sending some sort of. I think they've already sent some aid, but in terms of some deeper involvement in Lebanon, that seems like yet another dominion in the Middle East that will have Russian influence. And this follows Russia over the past 2 3 years, sort of doing honestly what Macron is doing right now and playing on the religious connections, like sort of painting themselves as the defender of the faith, but also having this weird, I guess, could say, alliance sort of deal with Hezbollah and the other political faction in that country. So Russia's already been making its inroads into Lebanon, and this crisis again will be yet another chance to um, get further inland, so to speak, in Lebanon. So hopefully the great powers, as it were, can diffuse this. But I hate to say it, I have a hard time seeing that happening.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it would be in the interest of both, I think, the French and the Russians to have a more functional and peaceful Lebanon. For one reason, primarily, is that it would give less credence to the idea that Israel spouts that they are in danger of attacks from Lebanon. Even though like basically these are very simple rockets. Not all the time. They have been getting more sophisticated over disputed land around the Golan Heights or around northern Israel. I mean, nobody bats an eye if Israel invades parts of Lebanon, and like when the favor is returned, that's when we begin examining the cycle of violence. But it does, I think, it is something that they would want because ultimately that would mean dealing with Syria in a more simple fashion. But um, of course, Russia has strong ties with Iran, and that means that it has to negotiate with Iran with respect to Hezbollah, which again, in turn, entangles it with Israel. But yeah, I think you bring up some good points. The Russians have already promised 2 or 3 plane loads of medical aid. These are those very large planes, very similar to the French, that can otherwise carry tanks and armored vehicles. So lots of supplies. A lot of countries are going to be, giving aid, especially I think to send a positive message globally speaking.
Oh, of course. I see countries again as disparate as Iran and Israel, both pledging aid, and again Russia and Western countries. So it, in the early stages, we're seeing this time of unity and everyone coming together after a tragedy. But again, once the economic hurt starts to set in more than it already has, that's when things are going to get messy. And as you said, I think the best way out of this, both short term and long term, is some sort of Franco Russian agreement to ease the situation. And again, that also takes an arrow out of Israel's quiver in terms of Lebanon is the grave threat. And we've seen this happen before, not entirely, but to a degree, in Syria. Once Russia became more involved and took more of a role in Syria, it took away a lot of the justifications for Israeli actions in Syria when they could negotiate with the Russians over Syria and the Iranian presence in Syria rather than trying to negotiate with them or confronting them. So we may see a situation
Right.
play out like that. I would say that's best case scenario, but
Mm.
it's still really hard to see at this point, considering the fact it's not even 2 days since it happened, not even a week since it happened. And like I said, hopefully we'll get some sort of diffusing by the international community, but unless they can buoy up the economy to the point where people can scrape by, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I just wonder what kind of economic package is being proposed to Lebanon and what it is they may lose in the process in terms of autonomy. But I suppose maybe in some ways this day was coming.
Yeah,
Um,
no offense to any of our potential Lebanese audience out there, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you this. Lebanese sovereignty hasn't really existed in any real form since the 1970s.
yeah.
So it's really not a surprise that it's going down this path. But with that being said, I suppose we can move on to Lebanon's neighbor in Syria.
Hmm.
There's been
Yeah.
some.
So things there's several flashpoints developing in Syria now. Um, some of the things that we were prognosticating to occur in May or June of this year are now finally ramping up. Clashes between the SSA and Tahrir al-Sham and other Islamist organizations in Greater Idlib are fighting in the Latakia Hill regions. This is in the southern part of Idlib. There seems to be casualties on both sides. There seems to be false reports on both sides, but artillery is being exchanged. 1 or 2 towns were taken by the SSA, with the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, and Russia began on August 3rd to bomb certain sectors. Um, again, it'll be interesting to see what develops out of this, because we've seen this act before, where a certain amount of ground is taken. Some of it has to be given back, albeit the gradual move has been a slow but whittling away of Greater Idlib. And I think because this is playing out on the southern end, near the Russian base of Latakia, I think the Russians will be more willing to bargain for, you know, acquisitioning that land, which has been taken from the Islamicists in that region. So uh, there's, I think there's just more uh, skin in the game for the Russians in this regard. The other thing that's happening
Is
is
the anti-civilization movement in eastern Syria.
that's right. That's right. So basically, nomads have taken over two cities in the Deir ez-Zor region of Syria along the Euphrates. I mean, this land has seen this many, many times, well before the Bronze Age. No, we're joking. It's so some Arab tribes have begun moving into this region, and the region of Deir ez-Zor has been under SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're Kurds, and they work with the Americans. They're the ones who are working on a deal to literally steal Syria's oil and sell it elsewhere, just like the Kurds did in Iraq.
Sell it to Israel, you mean?
Uh,
Because where else is it going?
yeah, that's right. That's right. They're going to need a pipeline, but they don't have one yet, and they're going to have to find clever ways to transport it because the Turks are not going to cooperate with them anyways. So, so these tribes have moved in, and an SDF soldier has died in the process. They have evacuated these towns because apparently they seem to be Arab majority, or they have a very significant Arab minority, and protests have been going on in there. And essentially, they've seceded two towns. So um, there have been some ISIS attacks, of course, in a region just a little west of there. And again, sadly, there's the couple odd Syrian soldiers who've died. I saw a report of three, then another one of four in the last 10 days. But Syria seems to be serious about focusing on Idlib right now.
So, has there been the words of Russia backing Bedouin warrior tribes fighting against the Syrian Democratic Forces, or is it perhaps Iranian funding this time? But just
Yeah.
it is interesting because these groups have been around longer than most civilizations have, and they've lived as tribal nomads. And out of all the things 2020 has brought us, one thing it cannot shake is tribal nomads taking cities from the forces of civilization.
It's a play that's been repeated for millennia after millennia.
Yeah, it is it, it is an interesting development in all honesty, that because they don't seem to be the Sunni jihadist types like Al Qaeda or ISIS. It seems like just normal people who want to get back to living their secluded lives and are tired of this war, tired of all these different factions coming in, whether that be the Syrian government, whether that be the Iraqi government, whether that be the SDF, whether that be ISIS, Al Qaeda, the moderate rebels, etc. And they really just want to live in their secluded desert. And I can sympathize with that in many ways.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting development. I wonder when they're going to start showing up on the map and what color they will be. That'll be an interesting development. The
Yes, that's right.
and frankly, I think we may see the most successful attempt at anarchism that has ever been tried. And who would have thought it's a bunch of tribes who still live in the pre-Bronze Age. I mean, like I said, it's admirable in many ways, and I say let them
Bro,
have it.
I just want a nomad,
Yeah,
you know?
it's like all these factions that say Sunni, Shia, yeah, the Baathism, theocracy, democracy. I just want to be a nomad. Okay, that's all I want.
Yeah.
Uh,
I just want to roam, you know?
there we go. There we go. It's probably the epitome of that. And look, best of luck to them. Just let them carve out that little area, that little circle on the eastern border, and leave them alone. Hell, give them the oil fields. Let them decide who gets the oil. That'll be an interesting thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, they're basically, I guess they're the equivalent of the Mennonites or the Amish of the Arab world.
Wow. Um,
I, I've gone too far.
yeah,
Never
yeah,
mind.
I think you are stretching it a bit. But oh, the Ruthenians of the Arab world.
Oh, ouch.
There we go. I think I figured it out. But with with that out of the way, I hope you guys know what Ruthenians are, because that joke's can probably fall flat. But I
Yeah.
think we've spent way too much time on this than it deserves. So you know, but Syria, it seems like I said, things have calmed down, and as they're picking up in Lebanon, we may see a shift from there, and of course, that shift can lead to escalations in both. Really, I didn't hear any news of U.S. patrols being chased around by Syrian and Russian patrols, but I can assure you it probably happened, because it does every week at this point. But again, it is that slow crawl towards Idlib and the anti-civilization revolution in eastern Syria. That's pretty much the key points you need to know. There's pro-opposition forces in Turkey going on about how we must support the opposition this time of Russian and Syrian planes bombing bakeries that make gay wedding cakes for Kurdish lesbians, or whatever the new narrative is. I've lost track at this point. But moving on to the much more interesting, much more tense Libya, which will lead us into some of the news about Egypt and Turkey and etc. But let's cover what is happening in Libya real quick. So looks like Egypt has really stepped up their game and is not going to tolerate a GNA-controlled Libya. Now, they've deployed air defenses there, they've deployed troops there, medical aid, I'm sure you can see on the map. And it looks like it's actually halted this GNA defense. As you can see on the map, GNA in blue, LNA in red. The orange indicates Egyptian support for the LNA. And I guess they are going all out with it, because we speculated this for a couple weeks there, especially last week. We saw that it was pretty much going to happen, and that Egypt was really going to start to play the role of a regional power rather than just this massive entity that remains neutral and everything. And I am interested to see where this goes. Where Egypt will be in the next 6 months, or hell, even 3 months at this point. Will the United States be happy with them supporting the LNA forces when the United States officially recognizes the GNA? Who knows? Granted, the United States have seemed to cut its losses to the GNA when they withdrew their troops around this time last year. Again, one thing I'll give Trump a lot of credit on is he actually did withdrawals from Libya, and possibly avoiding another Benghazi or another sort of style situation like that. That's one thing I really harp on when it comes to giving Trump credit on anything. It's Libya, sort of leaving the situation alone. France has been pretty quiet from everything I've seen this week. So is Russia. It seems like the entire world is focused on Lebanon, and not without good reason, I should say. But you have all of that happening, and like I said, this is really, I think we're seeing the rise of a new Egypt, an Egypt that's willing to throw around its weight in the region with its neighbors. An Egypt we haven't seen since the 1973 war with Israel.
Yeah.
That was really the last time they took a stand on either side and didn't just walk this line. But yeah,
Well, I mean, I think they're concerned. They're concerned about basically Turkish overreach. Like, there's a video that surfaced from a few days ago. It's this like well-crafted video of these enormous military forces gathered with flags on what appears like a runway airstrip. And it's, the various Syrian factions that have been fighting on behalf of Turkey um, in Libya. And they are commemorating the return of Hagia Sophia back into a mosque. So, like what we were saying earlier this year about, Erdogan wanting to basically become the representative of Sunni Islam. I think also sensing the weakness of the Saudis. I think it's predictable that he would have done that, given his career, especially over the last 10 years. So I think these kind of videos go viral in the Middle East, and they don't just pass under the attention of the Egyptians, right? So, um, they look at these videos and they're seeing like a major movement, perhaps developing. There's another viral video of what appears to be either the Taliban or Taliban sympathizers who unfurl a Islamist banner prior to stepping into the Hagia Sophia. Um, he's drawing all these groups and all these aspirations that they have to his benefit, probably sensing that there's eventually going to be, to some degree, some kind of multilateral breakup uh, between Turkey and European powers. But I say multilateral because I want to stress that I think America will use Turkey unilaterally as an opposition to Russia. Um, so I don't think that's going to disappear anytime soon. However, multilaterally and at times, it won't. At the end of the day, they will not be as much of a unified force as NATO was, say, during the time of during the Soviet era. But yeah, Egypt has stepped up. They're very serious, and I don't see Turkey making any serious advancements towards Sitra or Sitre. I am never sure how to pronounce that city's name. And there's been other conflicts, of course, now between Turkey and Cyprus with regards to Egypt again, because Greece has signed some kind of a gas deal in the Mediterranean uh, between itself, a unilateral agreement, economic free zone agreement with Egypt, which I'm very sure that Coptic Christians and Greek Christians within Egypt are very glad to hear this, because we know what kind of attacks that they've had to suffer within Egypt because of Islamists, which are, in the end don't benefit Egypt either.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's not exactly like, look, there's plenty of criticisms in terms of Egyptian security and allowing those attacks to happen, or negligence or incompetence. But one thing you can say about Sisi, it's not exactly like he's a hardline Islamist. In fact, he's quite the opposite. As we were saying last week, 2 weeks ago, he's sort of the relic of the era of the secular military strongman dictatorship, and it looks like now he's really starting to assert that. Which, again, this is probably the last time since, I don't know, Saddam was in power that we actually had a country in the Middle East with that structure of government that could project powers outside its border. Now, of course, he had that somewhat of that arrangement in Syria, but it's not like Assad was exactly a major player on the stage before the civil war, and in fact, his capabilities have been diminished. And
yeah.
again, we've been over this. You can take a look at Syria, but it really is the return to that structure. And if Sisi, for all his faults, can paint himself as the defender of the religious minority against a Turkey that backs the Muslim Brotherhood and is the hub of Sunni Islam, that's quite the making for yet another regional conflict. And Egypt can draw the support of plenty of Europeans. I mean, uh, probably not the
Oh
United
yeah.
States. I mean, as we see Russia already, who knows what the Chinese will do? I don't imagine the Chinese will be siding with this neo-Ottoman Empire, as it were. But you never know. I they're still kind of a wild card at this point. I would say that they could go. Look. I think they're probably going to go towards the Egyptian side, but there's that small possibility they could go towards.
I think they will, because I think that to some extent China is worried that um, Turkey's projection into the future of being some kind of not just kind of like a leader of Sunni Islam, but also kind of a leader of ethnic Turkmenism, to make up a word on the spot, is going to get in the way of their one belt, one road.
Yeah,
I
I
think
could.
that's they. I think they see Turkey as very much a potential agitator, and that, again, as I said, that a unilateral agreement between the states and Turkey will probably be more covert and still exist. Also, with regards to Chinese expansion.
Yeah, and I know it's been like a very um, untouched subject in the Middle East because a lot of Middle Eastern countries hasn't said much about the Chinese situation with the Uyghurs or the Uyghurs or however you pronounce that Turkic group in Eastern China. But if Turkey wanted to, they have a lot of sway again over Sunni Muslims, which a lot of the Uyghurs are. They have sways over the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, which again also includes them. It, for all we know, maybe a little bit down the road, I think Turkish power and influence would probably have to expand more before this would happen. He could be the rallying cry that turns a lot of the Islamic world against China in that regard, and it
Yes,
could lead to an
yes,
interesting dynamic. And I'm also sure that China has its eye on the Suez Canal and wants, of course, infrastructure deals in Egypt before uh, a lot of the recent chaos broke out, including COVID and a lot of the political and military tensions in the Middle East. Egypt was undertaking this massive construction project in Cairo and all over the country and with the Nile. And again, I'm also sure the Chinese have their eye on that. So if I had to peg aside for that, I would say China's probably going to be on the Egyptian side along with France and Russia. But again, we're seeing a budding conflict. Everyone was expecting Iran versus Israel or that sort of show off within the Levant, within the Shia Crescent, which again, still very tense around there. Also, when you include the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, that area of the world is still very tense. But I think the tension in the Middle East is shifting towards Libya, shifting towards Egypt, in regards to Turkey and its actions there, and really the focus of Middle Eastern conflicts moving yet again from Syria to Libya. Now, for all we know, something could happen in Syria that maybe another chemical attack will happen that will bring the attention back over there. But if I'd take a guess, that's probably not happening anytime soon. But point being is, things are going to get nasty, and they're going to get nasty fast, and we're only seeing the beginning. There's already been clashes between Egyptian forces and pro GNA, pro Turkish forces. And as you were saying, Turkey was flying some of these groups that had fighting in Syria into Libya, and also Russia was flying some of its military equipment, some of its personnel from Syria, from Tartus, from the one airbase they're operating out of, into LNA controlled Libya. So things are really picking up there. And as you mentioned before, you had that deal between uh, Egypt and Greece. And you know what else is happening with Greece?
mm,
They've been having very close calls with Turkey. Now, this has been a theme for the past 3, 4 years now, ever since the coup.
yeah.
But it's escalated to the point of where they were Greek jets and Turkish jets were doing mock dogfights. Pretty much everything but live fire at each other. They were preparing to engage each other. It looked like they were going to at several points. And with the divisions in Europe, the tensions in NATO, and the tensions in the Middle East, with everything else happening, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but war between Turkey and Greece is more likely than it's been in decades.
I agree. And with this unilateral deal between Egypt and Greece, this is going to include some kind of a pipeline drilling deal in the Mediterranean. And Turkey has already called this null and void, because all countries, and especially islands, they have like a shelf. This is literally the geographic shelf underneath the island, and how far it expands before it goes into deep sea. And there's like two or three different levels. One can be controlled directly by the country. The other one is controlled by the country and other international players that it has agreements with, and then it goes on into international waters. And so, even though I'm going to presume that this drilling is going to be somewhere between Egypt and the southern part of Cyprus, because it's the southern part that's controlled by the Greeks. Um, Apparently, Turkey is said it's null and void because it's claiming that the shelf can't be included or whatever. It just it seems to me it seems like uh, it's a zero sum game. Like if they get this, then then we lose out directly somehow. As if Turkey isn't working on similar projects, which they are in the Mediterranean. So yeah, I think even little disputes like this will turn into much bigger ones because they're so cynical, they're so negative on the part of Turkey that it's bound to anger people.
Do you know one player on the world stage that's been absent from this discussion about Libya? Mostly
Mm.
absent? That would be the United States of America.
Yeah, it's very quiet.
Um, Look, I'm not saying we should get involved. I'm not saying it's a good idea to get involved. Frankly, at this point, I think it would be a shit show whether we went with the pro-Turkish or the pro-Egyptian side, which I have little doubt that we are backing Turkey's actions in some sort of backdoor fashion without getting directly involved. Again, we see this trend play out, the delegation of the American Empire's responsibility to smaller vassal states. And again, we sort of see it playing out in East Asia with our relationship with Japan, the Philippines, and even Taiwan at this point. And again, they've been relatively quiet in terms of actually getting directly involved and issuing statements on this. Even people like Pompeo, even the State Department, haven't said much on the budding Turkish-Egyptian conflict. And I think that shows how times have really changed in terms of American power, because if this happened, I would say even under the second term of Obama, there would be a hell of a lot more American involvement. And to Trump's credit, I will say this, rarely will I say that in this day and age, he's kept us mostly out of it. But again, like I said, you can be pretty sure that we're backing the Turkish faction, but we're definitely not a major player in this. We are working through other
Hmm.
players, and it's boiled down to really a contest between, again, Egypt and Turkey, with France and Russia on the sidelines. Who knows where the Gulf states are going to go with this, where Iran is going to go with this, even if they're even going to get directly involved in that region of the Middle East, that part of the Middle East, which, again, that's probably not going to happen. Maybe Saudi Arabia might send some arms to X, Y, or Z group, but it's becoming more and more of a uh, hot, hotspot as time goes
Yeah,
on, because there was stretches there where we would go weeks, if not months, not talking about Libya, because a lot of the focus in the Middle East was on Syria, it was on Lebanon, it was on Iran. But lo and behold, this is probably one of the most surprising developments of 2020, at least in that regard. Now, of course, with all the things that happened in 2020, that's a bold statement to make, but at least in regards of the Middle East, probably the most surprising thing is the renewed focus on Libya. And I think it honestly because they feared that the conflict would have been over and done with. There would have been the LNA in power with Haftar in power, again, the return to sort of a military strongman figure ruling in the Middle East. And Turkey did not want that. They saw an opportunity with the Muslim Brotherhood, with these fighters in Syria that were well trained, had combat experience, but were ultimately losing and fighting a battle that they could not win. So they put them somewhere much more effective, which at first didn't look like it was going to pan out. But as time went on, they showed themselves as being more and more effective. And we are where we are today because of that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really been in play. So much of our world. Um, it's Everything is changing very, very rapidly, and not not just in the Middle East, not just in Eastern Europe or Western Europe for that matter, but in the States as well. You really do get a sense of, the older order is disintegrating bit by bit.
And I suppose before we move on to Belarus, there's a little bit of Balkan news we can cover. It looks like those peace talks between Serbia and Kosovo have fallen apart completely. And can you really say you're surprised? Can anyone really say they're surprised on that regard? And that's on top of the massive protests already in Serbia, which again have, I suppose they're semi-related, have spilled over into Bulgaria. But again, the ones in Serbia, it seems like they are fed up with a government that has not represented them, and how
Yeah,
since the
it's
fall of,
Vucic.
yeah,
Vucic is the problem.
yeah, the probably the biggest pushover on the world stage at this point, if you could even consider Serbia on the world stage under his leadership. But it seems like there's revolts against him. Any thought of a peace deal, quote unquote, between Kosovo and Serbia, I guess, was unacceptable. Not that that was the primary cause of the protest, but it's definitely one of the main reasons people are out in the streets. Again, it mostly boils down to um, talks about the lockdown, about economic issues, but again, let it not be said that Kosovo isn't a main issue in that. And really, the protests in Serbia, as far as I checked, they aren't as strong as they were maybe 3, 4 weeks ago, but they're still ongoing, as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of factors. So part of it is because of COVID. Part of it is because of the tensions in Kosovo, the peace deal, which is a really sore point, of course, for Serbs for a long time. Um, and then there's the whole deal with Vucic, who is, for many patriotic Serbians, he's a completely ineffectual leader. And as you say, he's basically weak kneed. I actually asked a Serbian friend of mine yesterday, uh, does Serbia have uh, potentially patriotic leaders that could replace Vucic? And he's confident there are. But the whole point is, you know, to get rid of Vucic first. And the other thing he mentioned that was very interesting is that he believes that the Russians know him very well and um, have dirt on him, if that's one way to put it, and could be instrumental because some Serbs are literally asking for the Russians to find a way to get rid of him. um, that is a sentiment. That is a sentiment amongst some patriotic Serbs.
Yeah, and it doesn't surprise me that there is that budding desire for a closer cooperation with Russia, concerning the history between the two countries. And I guess probably out of all the protest movements in the world, the one most aligned with us, I would say, with people on our side, is probably Serbia, and the one also most likely to succeed to some capacity is also Serbia, because everyone hates Vucic. It's the right wing, it's the left wing, it's the center, because he is the prime example of when you try to please everyone, you please no one.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
frankly, aside from his uh, his comical height, which again he towers over any world leader he meets with. Good riddance. Again, that's probably the only part I'll miss about him being a foot and a half taller than literally anyone. I think Trump is probably the only one who comes up to his level, and I don't think they've even met in person. I think that meeting in D.C. ended up getting called off, but you know, uh, good riddance. Out of
yeah.
then out of Bulgaria, it seemed like those have largely died out, those protests there, which again was the interesting pro EU leadership versus pro American protesters, that sort of infighting going on
I
there.
know it's yeah, yeah.
It looks like that didn't last too long, so make of that what you will. I'm sure that isn't the end of that, but at least for now it is. But on to, speaking of protests, Belarus. Now, as we said last week, the week before as well, it looked like, oh yeah, this is genuinely a protest movement against Lukashenko's leadership, that they're generally dissatisfied with his leadership. Well, I do have to say, I do believe it started out as genuine. They wanted this guy, okay, he's been here for so long, he's ineffective, we want to move forward. But it looks like that protest movement has been completely hijacked, completely
Paused.
paused. It has turned gay at not even a rate I think we saw in Ukraine or Hong Kong. And,
Yeah, yeah,
frankly,
yeah.
I think that's impressive. Yeah, probably a new record. It seems like the more desperate the American empire gets, the CIA, State Department, the more risks they're willing to take. And I guess this one really paid off to the point where Lukashenko's own boy has turned his back on him, quite literally. That was one of the
That's
more
right. That's right. His own son.
that was one of the more interesting headlines out of that. And I don't know. Maybe he's Russia's man on the inside. You ever consider that?
he's Putin has him in his
I
in
mean,
his web.
didn't Putin give him the handgun? I'm pretty sure it was Putin that gave him the handgun.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
The golden handgun at that. So look, we all know when Lukashenko, turns up, when nobody can find him and they see him with two holes in the back of the head, we all know what happened. Okay, let's just get that clear. Put that on the table. No questions about that. Frankly, maybe he's the hero we need. Maybe he is Putin's successor. Maybe he is Lukashenko's successor. Maybe he is both. Maybe he is the embodiment of the Union State. Maybe it's Lukashenko Jr. that'll pull all this together. Who knows? But in all seriousness,
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of a common thread. You have right wing leaders, but you have them besieged with economic problems, taxation. Like you could say that about the Law and Justice Party in Poland. You could say that about Orban and his problems with taxation. And you've got a lot of these Eastern European countries and other countries, frankly, that you know, post-Soviet Union, their industrial base has been gutted, and the way to create a substantial economy is very limited. And this applies to Bulgaria, by the way, as well, and Serbia, and for almost all of the Balkan. And what you have is an elite class. Some of it are really directly related to people who were in power during the communist era, and they're no longer communists.
yeah, I mean,
All of this does come down to just power. It's like
yeah,
it's more about power than an ideology.
yeah, it's
And
opportunism, as you would
right,
put it. And also, one major fact you left out: the massive emigration rates.
right, yeah, emigration. So they're leaving the country. So they're losing their best and their brightest. And it's really an uphill battle for a lot of these nations to establish themselves. So, you know what? It's very easy to find corruption because there's a limited amount of money that is being generated or is being given by larger proxy powers um, that they have to cooperate with, and so on. And I'm not making an excuse for corruption, but I'm saying, like, if we look at it, why it happens so much, and of course there's different kinds of corruption. I think we're talking about civic corruption
Yeah,
here.
and
We're talking about
all I
funds
guess,
not making it to where
yeah.
they should be, or
Corruption is
we're
just
not.
another word for inefficiency. Nobody cares about corruption if they're meeting their life needs and living a happy life. That's the reason why
Right.
the people in the West have been so passive, because they've at least gotten their material needs. Now, of course, they may be miserable, but again, there's plenty of pharmaceuticals you can pump full of them to solve that situation. But point being is, when you have that level of corruption, the embezzlement of funds, and it's actually affecting the people, that's when they start to care. Just for that clarification.
Right, right, absolutely, absolutely, and it's why, like, you could say in the West that there is a moral corruption, definitely, and that there is a cultural corruption, definitely, right? And when and if, like, the amount of printing more money doesn't change the economy, we're going to see those other attributes of corruption take place. So anyhow, I'm not defending Lukashenko, of course. I'm just saying that this is it's common, and Western think tanks always know how to bring up that word, and it's a very palatable word both for Westerners to understand, but at the same time for locals, for in this case the Belarusians to understand. It's something that resonates with them. Um, but I just wanted to say that if we pull, you know, 5 miles out into the sky and look down at this situation and have a clear timeline, we can see how and why these things tend to develop. So yeah, a lot of these countries are gutted out, and for many of them, that is how they got into the EU. Was not in Belarus's case, but that's how they got in. It was a promise that they would close down the factories. Czechoslovakia and Hungary come to mind. So, um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Czech Republic, which has been historically known for being a bastion of industry ever since even before the Industrial Revolution. They were known for their mines, their production. I mean, the fact that a country like that today is subservient to just the European Union and doesn't have weight of its own to throw around tells you all you need to know about this post-Soviet era, about this era of neoliberal capitalism. This is what it does to countries. Now, I'm sure plenty of people in the West know it firsthand. Plenty of Americans who live in the Rust Belt, who provided for their family on one income with factory jobs, know that. But again, a lot of people don't realize this has been a worldwide phenomenon. Manufacturing has been localized to just a few countries. That includes China, other East Asian ones. Surprisingly enough, Germany. Germany's allowed to keep their
Hmm.
industry. I suppose that's what obedience buys
Oh, I
you.
wonder why.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah. So it's mind-boggling that way. And frankly, I think one of the biggest challenges facing people like Orban, like Putin, other more leaders that I don't know if you want to call them nationalistic, but ones that are more on the nationalistic side, ones who actually have somewhat of a vision for the future of their nations and of their civilizations, is they need to focus on domestic industry. They need to focus on drawing their diaspora populations home and creating a solid home base and standing pretty much up against the gutting of their countries. Again, problems we don't think exist in the East, that a lot of people don't think exist in the East, do, just on a more subtle level and just on a different level. And, funny enough,
Right.
sanctions have actually been somewhat of a saving grace for Russian industry because it's forced them to revive some of their own industry for the products and the goods and the services that they can't get. So, I don't know,
Yeah. It's
maybe.
a double-edged sword. It's hurt them in some ways and helped them in others. It certainly has been a poker, so to speak, to get them to
Yeah.
react. And, with reference to, other Eastern European countries, you brought up a very important point about, getting the diaspora to return home. And really, like for the more conservative diaspora, which left, and even the second generation, which is at odds because their home life probably has probably far more traditional and conservative values than the life of, say, the average Briton or the French or so on.
I think you have a bit of
Um,
personal experience with this. Do tell.
yes, indeed. So, if there was ever a time, for to make their countries more palatable, but of course, there are roadblocks to this, right? Because a lot of Western NGOs that want to have all these areas, preserved, turned into nature preserves, right? Block this process of reindustrializing those areas, and that was always intentional. I'm fairly sure about 10 years ago, I read something about even Baltic countries had these stipulations. So there's all these very clever methods that have been introduced to make sure those countries literally just provide some talent, um, some few resources like agricultural, and that's it. And they will always be under um, more or less the control of Brussels
Yeah.
and America to a further degree.
Yeah. Whatever sort of, I don't even know what you'd call them, magnates that they bribe to manage these countries for them. I wouldn't even say govern, since again they're it's it's a neo-feudal system in the gayest way possible. They farm out
Yeah,
the technical leadership of these lands to these worthless people. Again, I wouldn't go as far as to say that about Lukashenko because he actually wasn't that bad of a leader up until he tried to play this two sides game. But again, up to people like Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, Zelensky, which, oh boy, there's a little bit of a story about Ukraine I actually want to close out the show with. I sent this to you earlier in the week, but
Hmm.
or name Vucic, as we were just talking about. Name any of these Eastern European leaders post-communism, and again, ironically enough, a lot of these people were, held party positions under communism. And funny enough, actually, not to pretend like Putin is perfect and that he's turned Russia back into this great empire that it once was, but he came from that same crop of people. Funny enough, and it is funny to see the Western world forsake him because he took some. Actions in Crimea that they disagreed with, and that he just presents some degree of pushback. So, the other story I
Right,
had.
and if you know,
Go on, go on.
just to close out on Belarus, I did see an interesting video from France 24 about what was the average Belarusian in Minsk thinking about the election. What did they think about Lukashenko? And like you had one guy that like he's saying, "I wish we could go back to when we were communists. Everything was provided. We had some industry." And then he just sort of you know um, leans into the camera and with open eyes just says, "I hate Lukashenko." But then you have a little old woman who says, "We moved. My husband and I moved into this neighborhood, and when we did, we were the only people who actually had a car. No one else had a car in this apartment building, and now there's not enough spaces for cars." So like I understand it's bad, but it's not. There are far worse places on Earth, and it has actually been worse. And you have these perceptions. You like I'm going to guess like this little woman is talking about the time either at the end of the Soviet Union or she's talking about shortly thereafter. That and I'm going to guess it was during the time of the Soviet Union, okay? And even the period that came shortly after was when nobody had cars there except her and her husband. And now everyone does. And you have this other guy who like wants to go back to that, but he's not remembering, for instance, the fact that everyone had to take public transit, or a lot of people had to take public transit, and not everyone could afford a car. In fact, it sounds like very few people could afford a car. So these perceptions are interesting, you know, and why they hate him and how they think he's responsible. There's a lot of psychology going on here, about power and about the populace and about leaders and so on. There's something more afoot here um, than just corruption. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it is a civilizational struggle. And somebody was also pointing out in our live chat from last stream that among the young people in Belarus, even the ones who haven't had that much exposure to the West, there is still a lot of sentiment about the era when they were under Polish or Lithuanian rule. Now, uh, again, I don't know how widespread those sentiments are, but it's sort of like that those movements that crop up in Ukraine when they were nostalgic for again, I don't know, being under Austrian rule. I've seen that, but again, something separate from Russian rule. And in the minds of many, Lukashenko is associated with Russia, with the Soviet Union, with foreign rule. And as you said, there's a lot of reasons people oppose him. There's a lot of reasons people support him, and corruption is just a good broad stroke word they can use when it comes to explain the protest, because the people who don't like him from a perspective that may be pro-Western, pro-liberal, he's a corrupt neo-Soviet dictator. People who don't like him from a right-wing nationalistic perspective may say, "Oh, he's selling us out to the West. He's selling us out to whatever." People who have the idea of like the pan-Russian state, the Union state sort of thing is, again, also he's selling us out to the West. So it's sort of funny enough becoming a situation in Serbia where really everyone's just mad at him for a variety of different reasons. Now, I don't think it's gotten to that level where he's as bad as Vucic in terms of public opinion, but still, it's a comparable
Yeah,
situation.
Well, I mean, we should have Colton on because Colton lived in Belarus and he lived in Minsk for 2.5 years, and I spent time with him here and in Russia, and I like honestly, I never heard of like some youthful underclass that wants to bring back the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth so they could live under a different foreign power.
Yeah,
Never once, never once. So that might be a LARP right now that's happening with young people, but like honestly, how do you actually qualify that? And it's you can't really qualify it by just the amount of independent, the Belarusian flags that you see with the red stripe in the middle.
yeah.
Uh, that doesn't mean in 2020 what it meant in 1653.
Yeah,
You know,
admittedly, like I said, I don't know,
that,
I don't know how.
you sure you want Lithuanian Poland to run your affairs, Belarus? Like, I don't think so.
I don't know how far
Like, they're
back.
not independent nations, so
I'm not sure like how broad that sentiment is and how much of like a diaspora thing it is, but um, I was talking to a few people about that. But this other thing I wanted to talk about was this image I pulled up. So just to give you a broad thing, this man is let me pull up his name because I had this up. He is General Grigory Omelchenko, and he holds the award of the Hero of Ukraine. And if I had to describe to you who is not looking at this right now, he looks like a dictator from after World War One, but before World War Two, who holds a bunch of noble titles that no longer exist. That's what he looks like in this uniform. That's what he just the energy
mm.
he gives off. And he said, and I quote, he was demanding Zelensky resigns. He is a puppet in the hands of the Zionists, the real world owners. International Zionism plans to create the Heaven Jerusalem in Ukraine with the capital in the Dnipro. I believe that's how you pronounce it in Slavic.
Yeah.
Writes the general in his article. So this guy right here.
Is he wrong?
I mean, I don't think. I think he's closer to the truth than he's not. But he,
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
yeah. This guy right here who looks like a 20th century German prince, is out here dropping some facts, I guess you could say. And I really don't know what to make of this, considering the fact I'm pretty sure he's still a serving general. I'm pretty sure he's been at the forefront of some of the Donbass war stuff, even though,
Yeah.
again, it's a very odd situation because I doubt with those comments he's too pro-Western, but is he willing to be pro-Western enough to get support is the real question, or does he have this vision of a truly independent Ukraine that, oh, we can be separated from both the West and Russia and govern our own affairs? We'll be the new Kiev and Rus. I don't know. Maybe it's another upstart civilization idea trying to restore something that no longer exists. Maybe he'll find some friends in Belarus. Maybe he'll be the new um, king of the Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Ruthenian
Oh yeah, yeah.
Commonwealth. Yeah, I'm spitballing here. Okay,
Yeah,
give me
the,
a
the
break.
intermarrian years, right? Like
Look,
that, the,
I'm just
that.
saying, if Intermarium were led by a guy this cool, I would consider it a valid idea. But I
Yeah,
doubt it would be him. I hate to break it to you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not. I mean, there isn't anybody that's capable of it. I mean, definitely not right now. And honestly, I don't see that happening. Like for that to happen, the West would have to be far weaker, and Russia would have to be far weaker for something like that to occur. Like literally, all these states would have to be self-sufficient enough that they wouldn't even need any kind of dependence upon Europe. Secondly, they would all have to agree that essentially Poland is in charge. Poland is at the very least the military center. I don't know. Hungary is like the civic or diplomatic center. Like how's I don't see how it's going to get off the ground anytime soon, especially because we live in a much less feudal age. Like we've discussed this before about how the idea of nationhood now in many ways, it's even stronger than it was a century ago. Um, even though it's subverted, even though globalism tries to erode it, it's not always successful, and it's not successful everywhere. And so we don't live in that kind of feudal age where you have various groups under one kingdom, and they're all Polish Lithuanian. They all somehow become that for a period of time. It's accepted,
Yeah, we're in an era
and even
where,
then, that didn't always go well. So yeah, I
yeah,
mean, it's just it's a, I understand, it's a romanticization of the past. A lot of it is based in truth, and a lot of it is based on the fact that, like, the trajectory for a lot of these nations going forward is not going to be certain, and it probably won't be easy. So it's happening everywhere. I mean, we feel it in the West. We've reacted similarly over the last few years, and I dare say it's the truth also in Russia.
I do have to say though, you do see this. We are in the era of nation states, and the idea of nationhood and nationalism and identifying with your national ethnic group has become commonplace since the end of World War One, since the collapse of the multi-ethnic empires in World War One. Nationalism won the day there. But
Yeah,
you do see this longing in Ukraine, in Hungary, in Poland, and even in Russia, Belarus, wherever, where they desire almost to return to an age of empires, of civilizations, of many people living under one banner and becoming great under that one banner. And
yeah,
you you brought it up that uh, globalism is trying to erode nationhood, erode nationalism, but it also, I would say, not only erodes those two things in particular, it perverts them. It turns nationalism into something that, oh, here's something you could have while you're subservient to this order. And it turns this longing for a civilization, something greater than even your nation that can be part of, into this, again, this perverted order of neoliberalism. Look at the European Union. Imagine how many European kings and emperors from Germany, uh, Spain, France, wherever, dreamed of a Europe united under one banner. Now, I can tell you, their dreams was, a Christian Europe under a feudal system or a more monarchic system. They would have never envisioned in 1,000 years a united Europe to look like this. So, you have that same primal desire that has been completely bastardized. So, just to give you an idea of where I was going with that.
right. That's a great point, and yeah, I don't mean to minimize that. The longings of people who were part of the Polish Lithuanian Empire at one time, why they would want that back, and why that was special for them, and why that's to some degree interwoven into their identity. Um, so I respect that. As you said about the EU, about how globalism works, you're right. It perverts it. I mean, on the one hand, they'll have laws that deal with trade, that deal with crime, that deal with border crossings. All of it respects the idea of nation, and then, but internally, all of it internally, where it matters on the level of people, the citizen, all of that becomes abstracted. Anybody who lands on your shores is also just as much British as you are, just as much French as you are, just as much Latvian as you are, or whatever. So it's very clever the way they've managed to do this. But yeah, there, as you say, there is maybe there is a push. Maybe in some ways you could argue that globalism, consciously or unconsciously, is trying to um, get ahead of the curve toward something else that's happening in Europe. Um, uh, I don't know what to call it, but a kind of greater cooperation between states. And but on, of course, the EU wants that on their terms, not on. They don't want any kind of free players in this. So yeah, a lot of these countries are going to have to stick together, and they're going to have to stick together uh, basically to counteract the EU, because Russia is not really their enemy. Their sovereignty depends on being able to tackle um, the EU and, lastly, America. That's what it depends on, because that's where the donations come from. And really, they wouldn't come there if Russia were conquered if Russia were just like another Poland or Ukraine.
Yeah, they are allowed to be this quote unquote based because they are frontline countries. The minute
Yeah.
Russia would slip into irrelevance, or the minute Russia would become another Yeltsin era sort of basket case, would be the era where they go all out with the LGBTQ propaganda in Poland. And look at how hard they're going already with that. Imagine
Hmm.
how much harder they
Hmm.
would go if they didn't need the justification that Poland was this bastion against Russia, where they need to keep some residual nationalism alive in order to counter that. And what I will say to the people of these nations, for as many of them listen, which I think is actually, at this point, we have more of a European than an American audience, which I suppose in terms of the content we talk about and the places of the world we talk a lot about Europe. If you haven't noticed, believe it or not, we've just been doing it for the past half hour. But yeah, okay, I can understand why you don't like Russia. There is a nasty history there, but at this point, if you're not at least willing to use any cooperation they would offer you to your advantage, like at least try to do what the Hungarians do, at least try to do what the Turks do, and play to the dynamics of the rivalries of the major powers of the nations. If you really want to get off the ground, you're not, again, you may dream of being the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, but you are not at this point. You do not have the power the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had, and you're gonna have to make some concessions. You're gonna have to play uh, by the rules of the great powers. You're going to have to shake hands with people you would otherwise detest. So that's my final word on that. And
Yeah.
again, I do feel for these people. I do feel their desire for a genuine nation state, for a genuine civilization. But again, like many places in the Western world, like many places around the world, that has been perverted by the ideas of globalism and neoliberalism. We felt it here with Trump. I think the British have felt it with the failure of Brexit. And I think now the Eastern Europeans are really starting to feel it with, especially in Poland, how much of a battleground it's become over the LGBTQ issue. I think is
I mean,
that
it's all over Reddit. Reddit is constantly complaining about Poland. They're constantly demonizing Poland.
yeah, and Poland's, again, their last saving grace is the rivalry with Russia. So long as they are on the front line, and even if I think Belarus were the flip, they would go much harder on Poland. Now, would they try to completely capitulate it? I think there had to be a complete collapse of Russia into a Yeltsin style system. But again, look at how hard they go now, and imagine if there was no incentive to keep Poland "quote unquote" based.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the final word I'll leave our Central European audience with is learn from Orban. He is probably the most sane and of all of you, and probably has the most rational vision for your region.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I think that's a wrap, though.
Yeah. That's all I have.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report, and goodbye.
Take care.